Well, I've been thinking about this a little bit since I've seen this headline. It's not the first time I've seen headlines and articles pertaining to the same sort of BS, and BS, I believe it is, where you'll have somebody from, in this instance, the Rainbow Unicorn government, talking about institutional racism, racism in general, etc., and the need to right those wrongs. Now, what is more detrimental to an ethnic minority individual in our country? I would say that it would probably be more detrimental for somebody such as Ruth McGuire, an SNP Rainbow Unicorn feminist, to sit there and feed more or add more fuel to the fire, so to speak, in terms of generating this narrative that ethnic minorities are being essentially persecuted, they are marginalized, they are the victims of racism. The only people that benefit from a narrative such as this is the activists, the BAME type activists, the anti-racist activists, etc. And it gives the likes of Ruth McGuire and other Rainbow Unicorn feminists, as well as anybody in the Rainbow Unicorn Parliament, it gives them the opportunity to appear virtuous. I don't really think there is anything beneficial to come out of the other side of telling people that are not ethnically Scottish, that live in Scotland, that because they're not ethnically Scottish, they are forever shackled, they are forever oppressed, they can't reach the top of their potential career ladder because of the very fact that they are not ethnically Scottish. I think that's more feasible than to suggest that there is institutional racism in this country. I think it's more feasible to suggest that these people are actually the problem. They claim to be trying to fight a problem, but in doing so, become the problem. Now, years ago, and I tried to find a video, and I must have deleted it because I deleted a lot of old videos on my channel. There was Theresa May, she came out and she talked about the ethnicity pay gap. Now, from my understanding of the ethnicity pay gap, it was identical to the gender pay gap in terms of they added up in a company every male salary against every female salary, and there was your little disparity at the end of it without taking into consideration people that were in specific roles. They just showed you there's a disparity because they're not equal. Inequality to these people is not the broad definition of equality. It's more about equity. It's all about equality of outcome. But it gives these individuals an excuse to force through their social justice related policies and proposals, gives them a chance to appear virtuous, and it gives the BAMEs, the activists that speak on behalf of the BAMEs, it gives them more fuel to proclaim that they are the victim of eternal racism. So here we have on the screen another example of this, where it says that Scotland's public bodies are failing on racism. And SNP MSP has said. Ruth McGuire, who heads the Equality Committee, she's the chubkeek in chief who runs the Equality Committee, and she's hit out at heads of the major authorities on the Holyrood Committee. She leads and calls for public bodies to be compelled to reveal how much they pay their ethnic minority staff. Now, it's illegal to pay people differently based on who they are. So we're going down this line of thinking that because there's less BAME people in an organisation, they've taken the tally of all the ethnically Scottish, or just white in general for this case, because there could be other, Europeans and whatnot. They've taken all of that and they've put it alongside the amount of blacks and browns, etc. in said company. They've added up, they've tallied up the overall average earnings, and look at that, there's a disparity. It's just ridiculous. Holyrood's Cross-Party Equality and Human Rights Committee says in work poverty levels and rates of unemployment amongst minority communities remain unacceptable in modern Scotland. This term, modern Scotland, it comes up far too often these days. They want you to accept that because this is the present day, things have to be the way that they want them to be. And as I have pointed out on numerous occasions before, 100 years prior to this, you could have said the same thing. Our ancestors would have said that was modern Scotland because that was the there and then. But now we are in the here and now, and it's modern Scotland again. But this time it's different. It's different purely because things have to change in a progressive mannerism to suit the progressives, of course. And you have to accept it because it's modern Scotland. What makes today different from 100 years ago? Fucking nothing. Nothing, really. It's just a date. What, because we're in the present day, we have to adopt new standards? Figures from 2019 put the ethnicity employment rate gap at more than 16%, up 2 percent points since 2017. The rate for BAME women is 20% lower than their white counterparts. Scottish counter-fucking-parts. Overall, estimates suggest workers from ethnic minorities earn 10% less than white staff. And this is, correct me if I'm wrong here, what they're doing, as I said, is they're adding up all the whites in an organisation against non-whites. And they're not taking into consideration the salaries that you earn depending on your job tier. So it could be the CEO, it could be the manager, it could be assistant manager, etc. And they're comparing that, if we're talking about the likes of Tesco's, to your proverbial cashier. MSPs in the panel say the public sector must work to drive change across society. Convener Maguire says the committee is seriously concerned by the lack of progress in tackling this issue, despite previous inquiries. And she says the lack of action is taking its toll on minority communities. It is extremely disappointing and frustrating that we regularly have to revisit this issue. Have you not maybe considered the fact that maybe the issue that you think is there doesn't exist? Because you can put all the things you want in place to try and rectify institutional racism, etc. But if it doesn't exist, how do you intend to rectify it? How can you eradicate institutional racism if it doesn't exist? Maybe, just maybe, that outlandish idea of a meritocracy still pervades society today. Maybe best person for the job type of thing. It's not fucking good enough, is it? It says here that it is little wonder that during our inquiry, we have heard many witnesses and representatives of black and minority ethnic communities refer to consultation fatigue. There is a sense that many employers prefer to look outwards rather than inwards, as though the issue lies with the minority ethnic communities, when the reality is that the issue lies with the public authorities themselves, because they're not hiring enough Dindus. They're not putting enough Tyrones into CEO positions. And that is institutional racism, because you're not picking that individual because he's black. They want you to pick him because he's black. They want you to shaft other people for the job because they're white. Put a black in there because he's black. And if you don't do that, you're racist. Okay? It's evident, apparently, that a key factor within this is the failure of the leaders of public authority to acknowledge that the existence of institutional racism, and in doing so failing to act to deliver a cultural shift within their organisations, because you don't accept their narrative. You're not doing enough. 10 people apply for a job, 1 is black. If that black guy doesn't get it, that's a clear-cut example of institutional racism. Despite the fact the other people, the other 9 people were white, but they were all competing against each other. So why can't the white person say that, oh, you didn't pick me because of something, some certain characteristic I have? They can't do that. They don't have the moral duty to be able to do that. But whatever. The probe focused on employers covered by the public sector equality duty under the Equality Act, which includes local authorities, health boards and more. Together, these agencies account for 20% of all the country's employment and should, Maguire said, demonstrate the highest employment practice and standards. But the committee heard evidence that despite various initiatives, the recruitment, retention and progression of minority ethnic groups in the workplace has regressed over the last 2 decades. Stop shoving people into fucking groups. Why is it okay for you to shove these people into groups? I'll give them an excuse to collectivise, but it's not the same for us. How many white people are unemployed? How many white people are being shafted? But because some are doing well in Scotland, that's fine, yeah? They also heard that there has been a resistance on the part of employers to acknowledge the existence of the gap. Because there's not enough black people in high-paying roles within their organisation. That's institutional racism. How many white people are on the payroll but ain't in the top? Just because they happen to look the fucking same. They're all individual. I mean, I'm not one that preaches to the choir about individualism, but like that's the sort of thing that we've all been taught to somewhat accept. They also heard that there's been I've read that. Recommendations include the increased use of positive action, which is positive discrimination as it used to be called, but discrimination sounds a bit negative. It sounds a bit discriminatory. It sounds a bit illegal, actually. You know, positive action. So what she's talking about here again, addressing the underrepresentation of minority ethnic communities. So you need to prioritise and give preferential treatment to people who are not white in order to bring these pay disparities into what could be considered equality.
And when it talks about new regulations to require public bodies to publish their ethnicity pay gap, it's the same sort of thing that they do with the gender pay gap. They want companies each year to provide proof that they are making an effort to decrease the gender pay gap. Now, how do you do that? You have to promote and prioritise women and put them into better paying roles within said company in order to reduce the overall average earnings for women in comparison to men. Now they're trying to do the same thing for the BAMEs. The report states that the committee concludes that chief executives and senior leaders within public authorities must demonstrate leadership in this area. It is 2 decades past the time for acknowledging there is work to do. Now is the time for concerted effort, definitive action to be taken. Maguire commented, leaders of public authorities need to be accountable for their organisation's record on employment of ethnic minority people. See, there's not enough blacks in your company. You need to do more. To address the lack of progress to date, progress being the operative word here, a rather dubious word if you ask me, and decades of damage, our report recommends that public sector employers prioritise employment for minority ethnic communities within their strategic roles. We also recommend that the government regulates to ensure public authorities publish their ethnicity pay gap figures and set out actions to deliver improvements within an agreed time frame. We sincerely hope that our successor committee will not have to revisit this subject unless it is to reflect on the result of positive action, accountability and eradication of institutional racism in Scotland, because there's not enough blacks within your company. It's institutional racism. There's not enough blacks getting paid more within your company. It's institutional racism. There's not enough black CEOs within Scotland. It's institutional fucking racism. Nothing to do with the meritocracy, nothing to do with the fact that Scotland is majority ethnically Scottish for the time being, which is pretty reflected and or represented in all organisations. No, it's institutional racism. So, other stories that have come out in the last few days, I mean, it's just really at this point relentless. You know, Sheku Bayu, a black man who died in police custody. Now, it's similar, I suppose, in the sense that with all the hysteria that followed George Floyd's, they talked about racism immediately. It was race-related, and it sparked the BLM movement, of course, to make a resurgence, the protests worldwide talking about institutional racism and police brutality, etc. And you could have got on board to begin with if they'd gone with the narrative of police brutality, white or black, but they didn't. They went with racial police brutality. And as it's now transpired, the man would have died irrespective of whether or not he was put onto the deck because he was going to overdose, and it was an overdose that killed him. Asphyxiation caused by said fentanyl, Floyd. But Sheku Bayu, the black man who died years ago, and there was an investigation currently, or an inquiry into the death of Sheku Bayu. It was announced this year, in fact, by Hamza Useless. And he had said that the statutory public inquiry will examine the circumstances leading up to the death of Mr. Bayu. The post-incident management process and subsequent investigation into his death, the inquiry will also establish the extent to which Mr. Bayu's actual or perceived race played a part in events, if any. If any being the operative word here. It's still ongoing. You know? So, why is there an investigation to see whether or not it was race-related? Because he's black. But it doesn't stop the narrative. It doesn't stop these people from being able to get airtime and sympathy and publicity all the time. It could be classified as exploitation, but it goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this video. How does this help the ethnic minority communities in general? Because you are consistently adding fuel to the fire and making people believe that there genuinely is a problem with racism in this country. You don't know whether or not it was race related, and I find it very difficult to believe that the investigation or the inquiry will come back and say that it was race related. But until such a time, you can't sit there and say that it was. It's incorrect. It's factually incorrect, but it doesn't stop them. Is Scotland a racist country? Lament for Sheku Bayou offers personal response to the 2015 Kirkcaldy tragedy. Now more than 5 years after the 31-year-old gas engineer, husband and father of two died in custody in the streets of Kirkcaldy, Lament for Sheku Bayou offers a personal response to the tragedy, an expression of grief for the loss of the human behind the headlines and a non-apologetic reflection on identity and racism in Scotland today. Right off the bat, we don't know if it's race-related. You know? It doesn't stop them. No, it never does. Performed in the Lyceum Theatre stage and streamed to audiences at home on November the 20th and 21st, Lament for Sheku Bayou urgently questions, is Scotland really a safe place? You know, and it really pisses me off because a similar story transpired in Scotland. Shocking images show naked inmate dragged to his death by guards with towel over his face. Nobody was prosecuted over the head of this, by the way. These shocking images. But there was no inquiry into if it was race related. Why? Because he was white. Now, you could, I suppose, argue with your little dopey hypotheticals that the inmates, the guards in question, they might have been white, but they were anti-white. And they did what they did to him because he was white. You could make that case. It would sound ridiculous, but that sounds ridiculous. But because Sheku Bayou died in police custody, it's not ridiculous to assume that he died because he was black, or he died at the hands of the police officers because he was black. Why is one fine but not the other? Because they're both as fucking stupid as each other. Anyway, in an interview with the Courier, Hannah Lavari admits that when Sheku died in May 2015, despite her being a woman of colour, the case largely passed her by. Mainly, she thinks because she didn't want to admit that racism might have been at work on the streets of modern Scotland. There's that word again, modern. When I spoke to other people about him, there seemed to be this general sense of Sheku who's that? What are you talking about? She says, because if it's not all over the papers, then that showcases racism. My starting point was to see what information was out there about him, what made me as a person of colour feel and respond to that in a lament form. But I think my overriding thing when I came to reading about what I could find about Sheku was there was so many racist tropes. I just wanted to find Sheku Bayou the human being in that. Talk about him as this deeply loved man and what that meant for his family and friends, that he was no longer there was with so many unanswered questions for the family. There's a helicopter flying right over my house again here. Fucking annoying living here, dude. Reflecting on why she turned away from the story in 2015, Hannah thinks she feels some of the language being used to describe Sheku at the time felt very much part of an old narrative about racism and the way black and brown people are talked about. Being supersized, for example, when he wasn't the biggest man there. The degradation which all kinds of feeds into the narrative that has been used to justify everything from the horror of enslavement, subjugation and colonialism is still used by racists when they talk about asylum seekers being less than human. There felt like a lot of dog whistles. I think with some of the shame around turning away from it, I wanted to turn back to explore as a writer and a poet and create a lament for him. As a person of colour, Hannah sometimes feels there's two Scotlands. There's the Scotland that denies there's anything negative about itself, that gaslights everybody that says Scotland is racist. And the only people that say Scotland is racist is people like Hannah. Isn't that something? I've been told, or I've read anyway, so many times I've lost count about how inherently racist I am because I don't conform to the standards of the progressives. I don't pander and I don't bootlick. Because I hate to break it to you, I don't give a shit about you. I don't. It's not because of who you are. Colour-wise, it's because I don't care for your little narrative. Your inferiority complex, your insecurities, and your backwards fucking view of the world. It's not my problem. Yet she says there was something about the language and the narrative of Sheku that spoke about something very familiar about life in Scotland. Hannah has been very careful not to tell the story of Sheku from any position other than as an observer, but because it's not been proven one way or the other whether it was race related, you're already overstepping the mark, irrespective of whether or not you are telling it from the perspective of an observer. She's unpacked the information that anyone else could find on the internet or whatever. In that sense, there's nothing in this play that's not in the public domain, yet at the same time her onlooker status is unswervingly from the perspective of a woman of colour. It's going to be live streamed, so hopefully there will be a feeling of it being live and a feeling of theatre. It's just riveting.